Welcome to the Play Their Way podcast, where we talk about all things in child first coaching. I'm your host, Laura Jane Jones, and today I'm excited to welcome our special guest, Martin Yelling. Welcome, Martin. Great to have you with us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Special guest. Makes me sound like some kind of special guest, which I guess is fun.
Well, you are the most special guest on this podcast today, if that makes you feel any better.
It does. Much better. Thanks very much.
Good. Martin's the CEO of Stormbreak, the charity aiming to improve children's mental health through movement. Martin, how intrinsic is the link between mental and physical health, especially for children?
Well, I think the two things are absolutely embedded with each other, aren't they? They're completely integrated together. And, we've certainly seen in the last few years, I'd say almost a radical shift in acknowledging the importance of that. You know, when you've been around physical activity, movement, sport, emotional well-being for children and young people, as long as I have, which is quite a while now, the breadth of experiences that you see helps you realise in all the contexts in which I have worked, there is this incredible link between emotional well-being, mental health, and physical activity and movement. And for many people, it's an accident that they find out. They're not sure why, and this is related to why we set up Stormbreak. It is that intrinsic connection, but people are not sure why they feel that way, and what's brought about this change in my thoughts, this change in my feelings and emotions. And so, for lots of adults I've worked with have had this realisation sometimes, particularly when they take up moving and physical activity in their later years. They're like, it's so good for me, isn't it? And you're like, yep, yeah, it really is. And so in children, that's exactly the case. And it's almost like children already know that it's really good for them because they want to do it. And then when left to do it, they do it. And sometimes as adults, we then forget how to do it. So we have to re-find it again. So yeah, I think there's a really important connection between emotional well-being, mental health, physical activity, movement and play.
You're CEO of Stormbreak, but also co-founder of the charity, and your background is in teaching, as well as being a competitive athlete yourself. Which of those two things inspired Stormbreak the most?
Not one single thing. So, look, I've been very, very fortunate to have a rich thread of my life, which has been shaped and supported, I would say, by physical activity, by moving, by sport, and that's a really important part of what has formed Stormbreak and how Stormbreak came about. Those experiences were things like playing sport myself as a young person. But actually, when I was young, growing up, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I found out I could do sport because I chose my parents carefully. But actually, the environment that I was surrounded with was difficult. It wasn't easy. I grew up in a single parent family, and deprivation and when I look back, actually poverty was something that we lived with every day. My mum worked multiple jobs and she worked really hard and she tried to keep things afloat to the best of her ability. And free school meals and no school meals and uniform and no uniform. All of these things were important in shaping my life in terms of recognising and trying to create opportunity. I also recognised and learned that moving and physical activity was something good for me. So from a very early age, despite also being good at it, I also wanted to find ways that it would shape my life as a young person, and then as a teenager, and then as a young adult, and then as a growing adult, and then I'm 53 now, so maybe a little bit more of a senior adult. So I took some of those experiences at grassroots level, and I was lucky enough to compete internationally, and I married my wife. Went to the Olympics a couple of times, We had the positive experiences over 40 years of some incredible people shaping, some not, right? Let's be real. But some incredible people, some teachers and coaches and, managers guiding our experiences. And so we drew on all of those things so that, when you play out, why is it good for you? When you do sport, why is it good for you? When you move more generally, why is it good for you? And so with that in mind, I did a PhD and a postdoc at Loughborough University, and we looked at, powerful things that teachers can do to support children moving in school, and the kind of interventions or work they could do with them. But that was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I was lucky enough to work with some of the world's top academics around embedding physical activity and physical literacy at that time. It's fascinating to see it coming back now. My first contact with Margaret Whitehead was probably 35 years ago. So it's fascinating to see an important paradigm shift in engagement in physical activity and movement, and then the important ways in which it shapes physical activity. So all of those things came together. I've got 3 of my own small children. Well, they're not small anymore. In fact, my daughter's going to celebrate her 16th birthday soon. And, they went through primary school, and as I was watching that, I'd spent a lot of my time outside of sport, physical activity, working in grassroots participation. I've been involved with Parkrun for 20 years. Paul Sinton Hewitt was one of our original trustees at Stormbreak. I've been the London Marathon coach for 15 years and coached probably hundreds of thousands of people, to change behaviour, actually, rather than coaching. I like to call it behaviour change. And then worked with lots of organisations like Adidas, Strava, Garmin, BBC, lots and lots over the years. And then putting those things together to say, when my own children were going through school, why are we not seeing anything that's radically different? I can remember my PhD lecturer, a lady called Dawn Penny, who was at the time really into exploring thematic notions in curriculum, and now she's a global leader in informal sport in Australia. And we were spending a lot of time discussing the important characteristics of movement, physical activity, sport and play, and how we could embed them in teachers' CPD. Fast forward 20 years, it still looked the same as it did 20 years ago. So that was how Stormbreak was born, because I thought there has to be a different way. And I was very interested, and always have been, in embedding physical activity within systems and structures. So within the healthcare system, we started working in healthcare 7 years ago, embedding movement and physical activity with younger children, because we were genuinely focused on prevention. We're about prevention and early intervention. We need to do that in places that classically that doesn't take place with physical activity, sport and movement. So, we do things like programs with social workers, and so that's kind of how Stormbreak was born, and it's still fun, I think.
There's a few things I want to pick up on there, and one of the things I know that we'll talk about on this podcast, because I've written it into most of the questions, is about this emergence of mental health issues in children today, the increase in mental health issues. But you've been talking about this for 20 years in an academic setting, and also you talked about when you were growing up and those anxieties around being in a single parent family, the financial things that came with it. Are mental health issues growing in children, or are we just recognising more that children are affected by things that for a long time we've ignored?
Well, I definitely think there's an increase in children's needs, and there's a multitude of complex factors that have contributed to that, including the rise of social media, including the demise of places for children to play freely outside, unsupervised, unstructured, without guidance, a limitation on the radius that children are encouraged to go. Also, reluctance and anxiety from parents and family. This is not just about the child. We as parents, often won't let children out beyond the bottom of the garden or gate if you're lucky enough to have a garden. And so, we've seen probably post-war, actually, we moved into the 70s and started changing a lot around food and nutrition and availability and support for children to play sport, to move, to be active. The number of volunteers across the UK is going down, yet we're trying to encourage children to move, and often they're in really important local community settings. Well, if you can't get people in those community settings, it causes issues for children and young people to be actually able to access those spaces. There's also been a rise in, I think, an important rise in noticing how people are different. And so there has been an increase in, the diagnosis of mental health, but something like, and of course mental health, remember, is on a continuum of really good health, mental health, like physical health, through to, low or poor mental health. And at the very upper end, we see mental health in crisis, and we see more of that in children and young people. And of course, there's a definite emergence of social media that causes a huge amount of pressure for young people. The way they interact with each other, and importantly the gaps and the ways in which they don't interact with each other anymore. I actually think, in terms of social media, we're experiencing a point a little bit like we were with smoking. Smoking was actually encouraged for pleasure and health, and of course manufacturers were at the forefront of promoting nicotine and smoking as something that would improve your social status and something that would bring you pleasure and social connection. I read somewhere, actually, that a marketing company actually managed, I'm sorry I can't cite the source for this, but get a brand of cigarettes in the hands of suffragettes, right? I mean, how... I think of marketing and big tech and media now getting things into the hands of children and young people, whether it's food and drink or a phone or a game or tech. And I think we have yet to really notice the significance of the challenges that we've created for young people by giving them such technical innovation in their hands for immediate networking. Not to say there aren't benefits, because there really are some clear benefits, but there are also some major drawbacks, particularly for young girls and women, but also, as we're seeing more recently, around what it means to be a young boy or a young man growing up, and of course for all those with challenges around recognising who they are more broadly.
You've talked about that immediate networking. I guess we live in a society now of immediate outcomes because of the internet and because of the growth of 24-hour news channels, 24-hour shopping, the ability to buy things on certain websites and they arrive the next morning. Is that the enemy of development for children in sport? Because we all know that to become good at something, I always like to use the Gary Player quote, it's funny, the more I practice, the luckier I got. It takes a long time to achieve in sport, doesn't it? Is the immediacy of today's society an enemy to that, do you think?
Well, so I actually think that achievement and good, you use the word good, are not necessarily the primary central ingredients for taking part in sport or physical activity. Certainly that's not a focus for Stormbreak. That's about as far away as we get. We have no or limited real technical input because we don't have a concern about how technical the output is. We're more concerned about a child's capacity to build an effective relational connection with their peers, their friends, or with another adult around them. We're more concerned about how they can build healthy, meaningful relationships, how they can develop skills of self-care, how they can understand what it means to be resilient in all its different forms, excluding the traditional form of resilience as one of grit and determination and kind of character building that sports portrayed. So, look, like, does the immediacy of tech impact a child's capacity to do sport? Possibly there's a feeling that I can get anything I want now. I work in the charity sector, and often, young people want to bring about immediate change. Yes, I want to make a difference. Yes, I want to, change the world. And, that takes time and effort and sustainable investment. And it happens because people are committed and dedicated, and because, they have a passion, and because they get enjoyment, and because they love seeing other people's lives get shaped, supported and changed. And so, when someone says to me, I would like to have a job in the charity sector because I want to make a difference, I'm like, are you sure you're ready for the time it takes? Are you sure you're ready for the time it takes? And so for children and young people, when they're doing physical activity or sport, or, it's like, okay, let's get to the core of what those activities can offer. And then let's understand how, either as adults or as children, we can adopt like an understanding of how to harness the benefits that the participation in those activities brings. Doesn't need to make you good. It doesn't even need to make you better. It just needs to help you, understand your place in the world, to help you feel valued, to help you make friends, to help you keep friends. One of the things we focus on a lot with children and young people is that relationships break down, and through playing or being active or moving, you have a great opportunity to rebuild them and repair them. And so, it is important that it takes time, because you don't get those benefits quickly, unfortunately. So to really answer your question, there is a direct need that everyone surrounding children and young people, including them and all those that surround them, understand that sustained, patient, compassionate effort is really required to help those children get the benefits.
The UN's rights of the child are obviously at the heart of Play Their Way, as any regular listener will know well, because I mention it every episode that we do. The convention covers every aspect of a child's life, with no one right outstripping another in terms of importance. But it's hard to get past the fact that the first thing that they name on the UN website is a child's right to relax and play. Is that something you see as a diminishing aspect of children's upbringing in the UK?
I used to work for an organisation called Right to Play. And they are a big global charity really supporting play. My wife was an ambassador for them. And, have we seen diminishing rights for children to play? So what's really important here is it's very easy to put something on paper. So I often have a struggle with rhetoric and reality. So do we see a constant rhetoric that children have a right? Yes. Do we see that in reality in children's lives? No. No, we don't. And for all the reasons we spoke about previously, and also, we're privileged. We're both in. I think you're in the UK. We're both privileged in the UK. Actually, we live in environments where often children and young people can have opportunities to play. However, what that play looks like in order for them to feel free and to grow is really different. And I think we've shifted towards... We were both talking before we started recording. We both have little dogs, both got little sprudels. Okay, I walk my dog. I exercise my dog. I shouldn't need to do that with my children. I don't exercise my children. Yet we've shifted towards everything being quite structured and contrived, and we've moved away from the power and potential of unstructured play and unstructured movement and freedom of expression through whatever it looks like. Hence that it doesn't need to be good or better, it just needs to be, it just needs to happen. And we need to take a step back and be led, by what we see and observe as adults, and trust in our young people that they know what they're doing. So, I have twin boys, they're 11, and when our school, they were starting a new school, when the teacher and the TA came round to speak to the children, we couldn't find them. Great start, right? We thought, good start, we can't find them. Our kids live many people call it feral lifestyles. We don't. Like, they're outside all the time, and the staff came round, and actually our boys were up a tree in the garden, right high at the top of the tree in the garden. They'd been playing in the garden. So they had to have their conversation with their new teachers, with the teachers down and them up the tree. Fantastic. I thought that was brilliant, because my kids were showing, real curiosity about climbing, and, they were connecting with nature, they're outside, they're all over it. And I thought, I wonder how that's going to play out when they go to school, because adults are the ones with the fear and anxiety around what looking after their children through play and movement could or should look like. So yeah, there's a bit of I think there's that slip in children's rights through artificial things that we've created, even though it's still on paper.
We talk about play and movement as one thing, because I think those of us in this sports setting can see the importance of just movement, participation and play as a part of that. Do you think in the education system in the UK there is a gap between the fact that children sit for a long period of time and then have a 15-minute break, then they sit for a long period of time and they have an hour in which time they have to eat their lunch as well? Is there a diminishing space for movement just in the education setting even?
That's a huge question, right? A huge question. And in fact, why Stormbreak is called Stormbreak is because we wanted to create cultures in which, within organisations, working closely with community and with adults in those organisations and children and young people, to find ways to embed and implement movement for mental health. That's kind of been Stormbreak's remit since we set up 8 years ago. Now, there are many pressures on an education system. And so now I'll often be faced with misperceptions about physical activity and movement by those given, in primary education in particular, a responsibility for ensuring it happens in the day-to-day. And often they don't. Might be through their fear, through their lack of confidence, through their lack of knowledge. But it also might be through the constraints around them. So they may place a focus unfortunately, but unwittingly, I guess. They think they're placing a focus on attainment. They've got intense pressures in schools to focus on attainment. Emotionally based school attendance is a huge issue at the moment, where children who are anxious are not going to school. So how do we create environments in schools? We're talking just schools at the moment. We've also done some work in hospitals and things with children with life-limiting illnesses and trying to support parents use movement. But just in schools, in primary schools, how do we create those environments through informal, often child-led movement? And in our case, that's really curated to support emotional well-being, carefully curated. And not all movement does that, let's be clear. Things like the Positive Experiences piece of work set up by Sport England and, Play Their Way, redefining the ways in which people should be framing children's experiences of movement and physical activity. That has not always been the case. And just because you move or just because you implement physical activity, it does not mean that that is a positive experience for that child or that young person. One of the myths we try and dispel in Stormbreak, particularly as we're seeing an increase in needs of neurodivergent children in settings which are neurotypical, so a mainstream school. We're seeing an increased need in mainstream primary education to support the needs of neurodivergent children, or certainly children with neurodivergent characteristics or traits. Now, the school are often fearful about what that means and what they have to do, and how they don't need to isolate those children and young people. They don't need to let off steam, right? So I was one of those children. That was me. Send him outside, let him run around for 5 minutes, bring him back in. Now, there's no purpose in that. Actually, what's going on at that point is lots of complexity in the way in which my mind is processing the day, and feelings of being overwhelmed. There might be a sensory overload going on at that time for that young person. So what we should be doing is viewing their behaviour as a need for something, a request for something, and then servicing that. In our case, it's through purposeful, careful movement designed to support them at that time. So if they're struggling with focus and attention, maybe having a break from the storm is a good idea for them. And maybe if we do that with everybody in the group, it doesn't make them feel different or stand out. It makes them feel part of everything that's going on at that time. And so ultimately, having recognition in a space, so in a school, having worked with organisations that they place enough emphasis on well-being and children's health and well-being, and their own actually as staff, that they can confidently allow children to express a need to move, and then they can confidently support that through an activity that supports the children, for example, feel ready to learn. In which,
these things often,
you may
feel quite obvious, though, don't they,
attainment.
Martin?
They feel obvious. Do they feel obvious?
The reason I say that is you've talked about school refusers there, and I'm very lucky that a number of my friends work in educational settings with behavioural challenged children.
Yeah.
And a lot of those children who have been school refusers and have had behavioural issues are now out of a mainstream school environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they are learning through boxing gyms or through football training centres. So we're realising that this physical movement is perhaps sometimes the antidote to behavioural issues, and not just for the children who are reactive, as you've talked about, those kids who are neurodivergent, ADHD. This is something that all children should be benefiting from, shouldn't it?
When done well, yes. That's a really important statement, because when done well and when in the right environment and when supported. So is it an antidote? No, actually, sometimes the needs of children are great. They need specialist support. And you can't simply get that by shoving them off to a boxing gym, right? There will be elements of that activity that might be helpful for some children when that activity is delivered well, and delivered with the needs of that child in mind. Right, and that's what's really important. And I think the recent Mind documentation on safe and effective practice has really shed light on the importance of that. Does movement, physical activity, all those community activities, do they have real high potential for supporting children and young people who are starting to struggle? Absolutely, 100%. Are they a magic pill that can fix people? Absolutely not. They can contribute towards, it might be contribute towards a young person's healing, right? Or a young person returning to school, or a young person recovering from something, for example, grief, But often in these spaces, children need a bit more help. They need a bit more help, and that might come through specialist further engagement as well. So, I'm a huge fan of implementing physical activity as a support tool, but it's not the only thing that children need. Children often learn to use something like that because they think, actually, that makes me feel better. And, and if it's brilliant as well, for all the reasons that we said, it's brilliant. I love going, I have a great laugh. I'm with mates. I've made new friends. I vent my frustration. And in doing so, at the same time, I'm taught meaningful ways to regulate my emotion, perhaps, and then I can learn to transition that into other areas of my life. So I become more confident about making a return to school, for example. Right? So yeah, I'm agreeing, but at the same time, I'm kind of giving a little bit of caution to think, you've got to understand it too. Otherwise, you're back into a negative set of experiences for a young person. So take, for example, a young person with an eating disorder, with disordered eating, an unhealthy relationship with food. And then you put them in an environment a sporting environment, where for many years, that sporting environment may have celebrated controlling calorie intake. Okay, what are the messages for that young person? It's reinforcing a set of behaviours that they're actually trying to escape. So unless the coaching and the support is done really well, then you can actually escalate those early emerging issues, rather reinforce them or repeat them. Whereas actually sport, movement, physical activity should be a really safe place for children to work through things they might be challenged by. Is that a kind of...
Yeah. I guess the reason I asked the question, though, is because I wonder if we are too reactive in these spaces. Is it a case that we are prescribing movement to children when they are showing signs that they need it, as opposed to recognising that all children need it and we need to build that into their daily routine?
Well, that's kind of why Stormbreak exists, in both spaces, is a preventative universal measure, I guess, because you're exactly right. Inherently, we move, right? But what we've seen, the rise of tech, with the rise of, even industrialization, I would say, is an extreme reduction in that. Extreme reduction. So, you talk to occupational therapists and they will say, well, babies are in car seats. The first 1,000 days of a child's life, hugely important emotionally, but also physically. So they're not developing the language skills, the literacy skills that they might have. They're also not developing the physical literacy skills that they might need. Why not? Because they're in high chairs, they're in car seats, they're in contained spaces. Their body awareness, their strengths, their proprioception, their basic kinesthetic skills are not as developed as they should or could be. So, there's a massive question around, like, what type of humans do we want to be in the next 25 years, or 50 years? Because undoubtedly humanity is going to change in the next few decades, faster than we've ever seen it change in the past. So for me, a big part of what we do is to really connect with what it means to be emotionally human. Really press into that. So what does that mean also for physical activity in physical activity in a movement space? Are we taking that away, restricting children's ability to move and play and be outside? Or are we really pushing into that space as well? And of course, I'm like, definitely we should be doing the latter.
For those listening who want to know more about Stormbreak and the work the charity are doing, how can they find you?
Just look at the website, which is stormbreak.org.uk. Yeah.
On the website, I noticed that there's a page where it's got the kind of three groups that you target: children, teachers, parents, and caregivers. Which group have been your biggest battle so far to get this message across to?
Well, that's a good question. And I think, we started, I can remember talking to people about movement above having to sit down and go, no, we're interested in moving, not in physical activity, sport or fitness. Why? What's the difference? Well, actually, there's a greater breadth. And movement can mean so many different things to so many different people. And that's really important when you're dealing with misperceptions. So battles often come because of people's experiences. So we start with, well, if we're working with a group of trusted adults, so we might work with a group of social workers. And we'll start talking about their own personal experiences. And often you can see that some might have, really positive experiences, and others have got very negative, tarnished experiences. We have to unpack a lot of what that means and try and reset for them the benefits. But at the same time, we have some very skilled physical education experts or coaches or sports coaches, and they're also very, they can be very set in how they think sport or physical activity can impact on children's lives. And so, always there's got to be, so I'll call it a compassionate curiosity. So, listening to seek to understand the views of those people, and then supporting them to try and see ways, often through change in young people. That's why people change their behaviour, because they see positive change in the young people that they're working with. For us in a social care situation, when we enhance placement stability, a child stays in a kinship or foster family or adoption family for longer, that is a positive outcome of movement in their place. I don't care whether they can do a handstand, right? We care about the placement stability. When a relationships are breaking down, that's the focus for us. When a child is anxious and they've got really high levels of anxiety, through movement, can we help them learn ways to be calm and worry less, and accept that worrying is a normal part of growing up and a healthy part. Experiencing and learning to wrestle with worry is important. Through movement, how do we get the notion of that across? Not, well done, you've got faster. Don't care. Actually, do you worry less? Yes. Are you now able to go to school? Yes. Brilliant. We've made some good progress. So often when you frame the outcomes like that to those people who you might need a battle with, it becomes easier because they see it clearly. You're on the same page as them. You're resonating with their outcomes. You're getting them. You're seeing them. You're hearing them. And that's, the reason why we also do a lot of kind of co-design work with children and young people to inform how we support them in their spaces.
Martin, thanks so much for your time today. It's been fantastic.
You're welcome.
And thank you for listening wherever you are. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, be sure to leave us a review and share this with someone else who you think might like it too. And follow Play Their Way on social media, at Play Their Way on TikTok, X and LinkedIn, and at Play Their Way UK on Facebook and Instagram. See you soon.